Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you and to make hopefully a contribution that will help the further debate on human rights and alleviation of poverty, going into a direction that is making possible to consider a more fundamental change for the future. I want to look at three main points, namely, first, presenting some considerations on poverty, then looking at the question of human rights, to merge them finally and to say what we need is reapproaching the question of alleviation of poverty by way of giving a right to society to come back onto the agenda. So let's first look at poverty, where we find especially three main strands interpreting poverty and suggesting ways out. That is, on the macro level, the economic approach based on the main assumption that the rising tide will lift all boats. Meaning, if we have a prosperous economy, everybody will gain from it. And this is, or would be the case on the national and the international and the global level. A second approach is concerned with individuals, suggesting that individuals have to improve their skills, have to be trained, and opportunities have to be opened for them, with them, and then they will have the opportunity to get out of the situation of being poor. And then we have on the meso level the approach, the consideration that we need organizations that support, on the one hand, training and these things, but as well that they provide goods to people living in poverty, to make it possible for them to survive at the moment. And this would be more the charitable approach. Let me now come to the second point, the question of human rights. Supposedly global, supposedly universal, and supposedly a framework, a scaffold that opens a space, or is open as a space for everybody getting the same rights. There is one important point we should consider when looking at this situation, namely that the current situation in terms of human rights and manifested in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is an approach that had been, in a way, morally, but also, and not least, economically, emerging from the situation after the World Wars, and in particular the Second World War, establishing a certain understanding of modernity and of economic performance of what modernity is about. You find approaches of Rostov, of Parsons, all in this tradition, setting up a tradition of the modernity is the West. Human rights are based in the ideology, in the ideas, in the economic performance of the West. So far, so good. It neglected completely the confrontation of the systems. Having said this, it didn't neglect them, it recognized them and wanted the West to gain, to come to the performance of the main and the only system globally. And definitely it neglected the periphery, meaning African countries, Latin America, South America, what is called today the Global South, which would include, of course, China. Now, this meant as well taken together, that we have an economic system that is particularly characterized by a split between society and the economy. Economic performance had been the dominant paradigm from which everything would start, but not in terms of the economic basis, but in terms of the economy is the society, and whatever else is doesn't really count. It is important to note it doesn't count only things that count, that are calculable, are relevant. So far, there is a question then, or we have to question then, what this is about when it comes to poverty today on the global level, but as well within the nation states. Of course, it is correct when we say it is important not to feed the poor, but to teach them how to feed themselves. But there is an important other point, and this is for me much more important. We should not allow a global system to produce poverty and to permanently reproduce it, and then stepping in with teaching them, the poor, getting out of their individual situation. So far, this should be clear, we are talking about individual interpretations. Individual interpretations in terms of the economy, individual approaches of human rights performed in support of individuals, but there is little or no society in all this consideration. Now, what we should consider is that all this is, of course, a matter that does not only deny rights, human rights, individual rights to individuals, but it is denying societies to perform in their own understanding, in their own tradition, in their own understanding of what wealth is about. We should not forget that the poverty, as we know it today, emerged not least with the globalization taking over countries like the countries in Africa and forcing them into the global system, forcing them into this gainful, monetary gainful orientation, where it had been not about producing what people needed, but it had been about producing what they could sell, which meant at the same time they were getting dependent from other countries that produced what they needed, what people needed, establishing a huge disproportion, establishing as well a huge inequality and dependency. Andre Gunder Frank had been working on this extensively, the theory of center periphery, the world systems theory, had been working on this, giving very important impulses. Economically, we find the split, the separation from economy and society, from exchange value and use value. In law, it means we find a decoupling from law and justice. I think this is a very important point, and justice is not a matter of individual relationships, relationships between individuals, but it is a matter of societies not relating to each other, but having their own understanding of what relations are about. This may be the national society, maybe a small group, but it may be as well the global society. This is important to accept that human rights and alleviation of poverty are one and the same and cannot happen on the level of finding individual solutions, and it cannot happen in terms of finding private solutions. Just to come to an end, concluding by making reference to more or less recent development, namely the dependency of United Nations organizations, not least the World Health Organization, depending on private money. It is now a foundation like as one Bill and Melinda Gates that determine the agenda of the World Health Organization. And they, as good-spirited as they may be, they do it in the interest of their own way of thinking, which is supporting people, supporting individuals, but not, for instance, building up public health systems in the different countries. This is a major threat now in terms of global policy in the health sector. We find similar things in the areas of culture, in the areas of education, where it is exactly showing this contradiction between individual performance, individual support, and society. We need society coming back onto the agenda, coming back in the area of actors. And this means as well, we need public responsibility, public performance that is there to find a way of alleviating poverty instead of bringing poor people out of their